The DNA is telling us. So doing the Y chromosome work, I found that there wasn't a link between Richard III and the male line relatives who are alive today.
What if the most sacred rule of a monarchy, the bloodline, was based on a lie? For centuries, the right to the English throne was decided by who your father was, but when scientists finally tested the DNA of King Richard III, they uncovered his biggest secret. It turns out the official family tree, the one that caused wars and defined dynasties, has a major error. And that error, hidden for generations, changes everything we thought we knew about who was really supposed to be king. The dig that shocked the world. It all started in the most unglamorous place imaginable, a city parking lot in Leicester, England. A patch of asphalt, gray and cracked, used by city council workers every day, but beneath that boring pavement, a 500-year-old mystery was waiting. For centuries, King Richard III was little more than a ghost, a Shakespearean villain. He was the last English king to perish on the battlefield, at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. After his defeat, history tells us his body was treated poorly, displayed, and then hurried into a lost grave at a church called Greyfriars. But here's the catch: the church itself was lost. It had been demolished centuries ago, and the city of Leicester literally paved over it. By the 21st century, most historians assumed the king's bones were gone forever, maybe even tossed into the River Soar. But one historian, Philippa Langley, refused to believe it. She led a group called the Looking for Richard Project. She had a gut feeling based on old maps that the Greyfriars Church and the king's grave was right under that specific parking lot. People thought she was crazy. Experts told her it was a 1 in a million shot. But in August of 2012, she convinced the city council and archaeologists to let her dig. The team had only a few weeks. They brought in heavy machinery and cut a long, deep trench into the asphalt. It was a messy, muddy dig. On the very first day, they found something: leg bones. Human leg bones. But that wasn't unusual for the site of an old church. They kept digging. Then they found the rest of the skeleton, and the entire team froze. This wasn't just any skeleton. It was lying in a hastily dug grave, too short for the body. The head was propped up in an awkward position, as if the body had been dropped in. But the most shocking part was the spine. It was twisted into a sharp S curve. This wasn't a hunchback like Shakespeare wrote. This was scoliosis, a severe sideways curve of the spine that would have made one shoulder visibly higher than the other. This was the first wow moment. The myth of the hunchback was an exaggeration, but it was based on a real, visible condition. The skeleton in the car park matched the ancient descriptions, but the clues didn't stop there. The skull told a grim story. There were multiple brutal injuries. A large part of the back of the skull was sliced off. Another sharp force wound, likely from a sword or poleaxe, had cut straight through the bone. This person had not passed away peacefully. They had perished in violence consistent with a medieval battle. The skeleton was a male, in his early 30s. The exact age Richard III was when he met his end at Bosworth. The location, the battle wounds, the scoliosis, it was all too perfect. The archaeologists were almost certain. They had found England's lost monarch under a parking spot marked with a painted letter R. You can't make this stuff up. For the first time in over 5 centuries, Richard III was no longer a myth. He was tangible. His bones told a story of a brutal battle and a hurried burial. The remains were carefully excavated, every speck of dirt sifted. They were transported to a nearby lab at the University of Leicester. At first, the goal was simple: prove it. Could science, 500 years later, definitively say, this is the king? The answer depended on finding traces of ancient DNA, a code hidden deep within the fragile, 500-year-old bones the world watched, holding its breath. The celebration was huge. The king was found. His story, once buried under layers of myth, was about to be told by science. But nobody, not the archaeologists, not the historians, and certainly not the scientists, knew what was coming next. They thought they were just identifying a king. They had no idea they were about to expose a secret that would shake the very foundation of the royal family tree. The bones held a deeper story than just one man's end. The cabinet maker and the king. When the bones of Richard III arrived at the lab, the real work began. This wasn't about digging anymore, it was about genetics. The team, led by Dr. Turi King, was stepping into a genetic time machine. But getting DNA from 500-year-old bones is not like what you see on TV. It's incredibly difficult. Basically, when a person passes away, their DNA starts to break down. After 5 centuries in damp English soil, the DNA is shredded into tiny, fragile fragments. Even worse, the bones were full of other DNA from bacteria, from fungus, from every person who had ever handled the skeleton. The team had to work in a clean room, wearing full-body suits and masks to make sure they didn't contaminate the sample with their own DNA. They drilled into the densest part of the bone, the femur, and also took a tooth. Teeth are amazing time capsules. The hard enamel protects the DNA inside for centuries. From these tiny samples, they began the painstaking process of extracting and isolating the ancient DNA. Their first test was for something called mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. Here's the simple version. You get your mtDNA only from your mother, and she got it from her mother, who got it from her mother, and so on. It's an unbroken line, passed down from mother to child, almost unchanged for thousands of years. So here's the deal. The scientists didn't need to dig up Richard's mom, they just needed to find a living person who was a direct descendant of Richard's mothers. Mothers. You get the idea. This is where the genealogists came in. They took Richard III's family tree and started tracing the female lines. They followed the line of Richard's oldest sister, Anne of York. They followed her daughter's line and her daughter's daughter's line for 19 generations. They jumped from England to Canada through centuries of births, marriages, and records. And they found him. They found a man named Michael Ibsen. He was a cabinet maker living in London, born in Canada. He had no idea he was related to royalty. He was just a normal guy. He gave a DNA sample, a simple cheek swab, and then they found another living relative through a separate branch of the same family tree who wished to remain anonymous. This was the control group. If both of them matched the skeleton, the case would be airtight. Back in the lab, the tension was unbelievable. They processed Ibsen's sample. They processed the skeleton sample. They laid the 2 genetic codes side by side. It was a perfect match. The mtDNA from the skeleton in the parking lot was a 100% match to Michael Ibsen. The odds of this being a coincidence were astronomical, something like 99.999%. The second relative matched too. The world exploded with the news. The University of Leicester held a press conference that was broadcast globally. They announced with complete scientific certainty that the skeleton found under the car park was, beyond any reasonable doubt, King Richard III. It was a stunning victory. A 500-year-old cold case was solved. A lost king was found. Michael Ibsen, the cabinet maker, was suddenly famous, the living proof of a royal bloodline. The discovery was a triumph of history, archaeology, and modern science working together. It was a story with a perfect happy ending. Yeah, about that, the scientists weren't done. Confirming the identity was just step one. The mtDNA proved the maternal line. But a king's right to rule doesn't come from his mother, it comes from his father. The team wanted to trace the other side of the family. They wanted to look at the Y chromosome. Just as mtDNA is passed from mother to child, the Y chromosome is passed only from father to son. It's the unbroken male thread, a genetic signature of paternity. If the scientists could test the Y DNA, they could confirm Richard's entire paternal lineage, the very thing that gave him his claim to the throne. This test would be more than just a confirmation. It would be a validation of royal history itself. It would prove that the official family trees, the ones recorded in dusty books for centuries, were biologically accurate. And this is where the story stops being a happy ending. This is where the scientists in their clean room accidentally stumbled onto a 500-year-old secret. They were about to find a bombshell hidden in the king's blood. The DNA was about to tell a story history never wanted to share. A family at war. Before we get to the bombshell, we have to understand why this next test mattered so much. It's not just about a family tree, it's about the very thing that tore England apart. The entire bloody 32-year conflict known as the Wars of the Roses was, at its core, a family feud over one man's legacy. That man was Edward III. Edward III wasn't just a king, he was the king. He ruled for 50 years in the 14th century and was seen as a titan, a perfect medieval warrior. And get this, he had a lot of children. He had 8 sons who survived infancy, and in medieval England, having many powerful sons wasn't always a good thing. It was a recipe for disaster. When Edward III passed away, his sons and their descendants all believed they had the best claim to the throne. This split the royal family into 2 main branches, the House of Lancaster. This line came from Edward III's son, John of Gaunt. Their symbol was the red rose, the House of York. This line came from 2 of Edward's other sons, including Edmund of Langley. Their symbol was the white rose. Richard III was a York. His entire claim to be king, his right to sit on the throne, depended on his being the direct, legitimate male line descendant of Edward III through the York branch. So here's the deal for the scientists. They had Richard III's Y chromosome, his father line DNA. To check if it was accurate, they needed to compare it to the Y chromosome of another male line descendant of Edward III. This meant the genealogists had to go back to the family tree. But this time, they weren't looking for female lines. They were looking for an unbroken chain of sons. They needed to find a living man who could trace his family, father to son, all the way back to Edward III. This is way harder than it sounds. Most family names change when a woman marries. A pure male line is rare, but they were in luck. They found a family line descended from John of Gaunt, the other branch of the royal family. Specifically, they found living male descendants of Henry Somerset, the 5th Duke of Beaufort. This family's male line, father to son, was documented all the way back to John of Gaunt, and therefore back to Edward III. The logic was simple. Think of Edward III as the source. One son, Edmund of Langley, leads to Richard III, the York line. Another son, John of Gaunt, leads to the living Beaufort descendants, the Lancaster line. Since they both started with the same man, Edward III, Richard III and the living Beaufort descendants must have the same Y chromosome. It's a biological certainty. If the history books are correct, the DNA has to match. This was the ultimate test. It would be the final scientific stamp of approval on centuries of royal history. It would prove that the sacred genealogies, the ones that justified the crown, were all true. The scientists took the Y DNA from Richard III's bones. They took Y DNA samples from the living male Beaufort descendants. They put the genetic codes side by side on the computer screen. They were expecting another eureka moment. They were expecting a perfect match, just like the mtDNA. They were expecting to close the book on Richard III, but that is not what they found. Not even close. The room fell silent. The scientists checked the data, they ran the test again and again. The results were clear, and they were impossible. The Y chromosome from Richard III did not match the Y chromosome of the living male descendants of Edward III. It wasn't a partial match, it wasn't a close but not quite match. The 2 Y chromosomes were not related. At all. This was the bombshell. This was the moment history cracked wide open. This meant that somewhere in that long, carefully recorded family tree, somewhere in the generations of kings and dukes and noblemen, someone was lying. Somewhere, a false paternity event had happened. In simple grade 6 words, a wife had an affair. A child was claimed by a father who was not the biological one. A secret had been kept, a secret so powerful that it had now been exposed by science 500 years later. The crazy part is, this discovery meant that someone in that sacred royal line was illegitimate. The only question was, who? Who was the fake father? This is the part of the story that changes everything. The DNA mismatch was a scientific fact. There was no debating it. The University of Leicester team rechecked, retested, and confirmed it with multiple labs. The paternal line was broken. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. The scientists couldn't tell where the break happened. Think about it. There are 19 generations between Edward III and the living Beaufort descendants. The break could be anywhere in that line, but there are also generations between Edward III and Richard III. The break could be in his line. There are 3 main possibilities, and every single one is a historical earthquake. Possibility 1. The break is in Richard III's line. This would mean that someone, Richard's father or his grandfather or his great-grandfather, was not the son of the man history claims. If this is true, it means Richard III, the last Yorkist king, had no biological claim to the throne. His entire right to rule, the one he fought and perished for, would have been based on a lie. His blood wasn't the blood of Edward III. This would retroactively make his rivals, the Lancastrians, the true heirs all along. Possibility 2. The break is in the other line, the Beauforts. This would mean that Richard III's DNA is the correct royal Y chromosome, but the living Beaufort descendants are not related to Edward III. This is just as explosive. Why? Because the Beaufort line through John of Gaunt is the line that Henry Tudor, Henry VII, used to claim the throne after he defeated Richard III. The entire Tudor dynasty, one of England's most famous, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, based its legitimacy on that exact bloodline. If that line was broken, it means the Tudors had no biological claim to the throne. Possibility 3. The break is even earlier. This is the what if that scares historians the most. What if the break happened with Edward III himself? Or what if both lines, the York and the Lancaster, are illegitimate and neither of them are related to Edward III? This would mean the entire Wars of the Roses was a fight between two families who both had no real claim. This is what the scientists uncovered. They didn't just find a king, they found a fundamental flaw in the story of the monarchy. The announcement sent a shockwave through the world. Headlines exploded. DNA test reveals royal affair. Richard III's legitimacy in doubt. What most people don't realize is how common this is. Scientists call them false paternity events, and they estimate that in any given generation the rate is about 1 to 2%. That sounds low, right? But here's the wow factor. When you stretch that over 19 generations, 19%, the math changes. The chance of at least one break in that chain isn't just possible, it's likely. Some calculations put the probability as high as 20 or 30%. So here's the deal. For 500 years, history was built on an assumption of perfect, unbroken paternal lines. Kings and queens went to war, cities were burned, and people were executed, all based on a piece of paper that said this man is this man's son. And the DNA of Richard III, the last king to fall in battle, just proved that those papers could be wrong. This was the WTF moment for royal historians. The discovery didn't just add a footnote to Richard's story, it forced a giant glowing question mark over the entire royal history. The media and the public were obsessed with one question. If the line was broken, who was the secret father? Who was the man at the center of the royal affair? Science can't answer that. The DNA can show a break, but it can't name the person. To find that answer, you have to leave the lab and go back to the darkest, most whispered about rumors in history. And those rumors point to some very specific suspects. The king's illegitimate brother? The DNA test opened up a 500-year-old cold case. And just like in any case, historians started looking for suspects. They scoured the historical records for any hint of scandal, any rumor of an affair that might match the DNA break. And they found some. Suspect number 1, Richard of Konigsberg. This is a name most people don't know, but he's a huge player. He was Richard III's great-grandfather, and his life was full of red flags. He was the son of Edmund of Langley, the founder of the House of York. But here's the thing, when his father Edmund passed away, he left a detailed will. In that will, he mentioned his other children, but he did not mention Richard of Konigsberg. This was extremely weird. To leave your son out of your will was a massive statement. It was the medieval equivalent of a public disowning. Why would he do it? For centuries, rumors swirled that Richard of Konigsberg was the product of an affair. His mother, Isabella of Castile, was rumored to have had a relationship with another man, possibly a courtier named John Holland. If this is true, the break happened right at the start of the Yorkist line. It would mean Richard III's entire family, including his father and grandfather, had no genetic claim to the throne. This theory fits the DNA evidence perfectly. Suspect number 2, the Beaufort line. What if the Yorks were telling the truth? What if the break was on the other side, the one that led to the Tudors? This is just as likely. The Beaufort line, descended from John of Gaunt, was already controversial. The line was originally illegitimate and only later legitimized by the king, but with a special rule saying they could never inherit the throne, a rule Henry Tudor just decided to ignore. With so much scandal already surrounding that family, it's very possible that somewhere down that line, a false paternity event happened. If so, it means Henry VII, the man who defeated Richard and founded the Tudor dynasty, was ruling with no biological claim at all. But then there's the third and most dramatic suspect. Suspect number 3, Edward IV. This is the big one. Edward IV was Richard III's older brother. He was the tall, handsome, popular king. Richard III was his loyal brother until Edward passed away, at which point Richard took the throne for himself, claiming his brother's children were illegitimate. But here's the crazy part. There was a rumor, even back in the 15th century, that Edward IV himself was illegitimate. The story goes that his mother, Cecily Neville, the Duchess of York, had an affair while her husband, Richard, Duke of York, was away at war. The rumor, which was shockingly specific, claimed that Edward IV's real father was not the Duke of York, but a common archer named Blayborn. What most people don't realize is Richard III knew about this rumor. Some historians argue that this was Richard's real justification for taking the throne. He believed his older brother Edward was illegitimate, meaning he, Richard, was the true and rightful son and heir. If this 500-year-old rumor is true, it explains everything. It would mean that Richard III's Y chromosome was the correct royal one from his father. But his brother, Edward IV, had a different Y chromosome from the archer. This would mean the descendants of Edward IV, the entire line that led to the Tudors through marriage, were illegitimate. It would mean Richard III was, in his own mind, right. We are left with a historical mystery that science created but cannot solve. The DNA proved a secret. The history books provide the suspects. The man found under the parking lot, the villain of English history, may have just been vindicated in the most unexpected way. His own bones, silent for 5 centuries, have told a story that questions the legitimacy of the very rivals who took his crown. The secret is out, and it changes how we look at history forever. What really makes a king? So here's the deal. It sounds like the setup to a joke, not a historical bombshell. We have a king in a car park. A king. Found under asphalt, not interred in a grand, hallowed cathedral. We have a perfect mtDNA match, the mitochondrial maternal line DNA, that proves beyond all reasonable doubt that this skeleton is him, Richard III. And then the twist, the one that echoes back through centuries. We have a Y-DNA mismatch, the paternal line. A shocking, undeniable break in the genetic chain that proves someone, somewhere in that long, proud royal family tree, was not who they said they were. An illegitimate child was passed off as a true heir, and that single secret has now been exposed by a team of scientists 500 years later. What does this all mean in the end? Does this incredible, movie-worthy plot twist actually change who is on the throne today? Does this DNA evidence rewrite the entire line of succession? The short, simple answer is a hard no. Legally, it changes absolutely nothing. The modern British royal family's claim to the throne comes through a completely different line, one established by the Act of Settlement in 1701. Their legitimacy is set by Parliament and modern law, not by ancient blood feuds or the fragile, breakable link of a Y chromosome. The House of Windsor is secure, but this discovery changes something far more important. It changes our perception of history. It proves that history isn't just a static, dusty collection of dates and names in a textbook. It's a living, breathing thing. It's a cold case, just waiting for the right technology to come along and crack it wide open. People watching this, people following this story, are looking for a mystery. And this is one of the biggest. For decades, we've asked, who was Richard III? Was he the monster? Was he the victim? Are we missing a key detail? The thing is, we've been looking at history as a neat, clean story, a morality play written by the winners, in this case, the Tudors. But it's not. It's a messy, chaotic, deeply human story. It's full of the same secrets, passions, backroom deals, lies, and betrayals that happen in the world today. The only difference is that we now have the scientific tools to find them. That DNA test is a time machine. It cuts straight through 500 years of rumor, bias, and propaganda and gives us a single cold, hard fact. And that brings us to the ultimate wow factor of this entire saga, the irony. The sheer, beautiful historical irony. Think about it, Richard III. For 5 centuries, his name was mud. He was the man painted by William Shakespeare as a poisonous, bunch-backed toad. He was the archetype of the medieval villain, the ruthless tyrant who allegedly murdered his own nephews, the princes in the tower, to steal the throne. His very image was propaganda, a monster created to make the new dynasty look good. Then, science stepped in. First, it proved his identity, giving him his name back. Then it examined his bones. It proved his scoliosis was real, yes, but that the debilitating evil hunchback was a myth, a piece of character assassination cooked up by his enemies to make his body look as twisted as they claimed his soul was. Science, it seemed, was rescuing his reputation. But in its final act, his DNA delivered the biggest punch of all. That Y chromosome test, the one that broke the chain, has cast the biggest shadow of doubt, not on Richard himself, but on the legitimacy of his greatest enemies. The Tudors. The break in the line appears to be in the lineage of John of Gaunt. And why does that matter? Because Henry Tudor, the man who defeated Richard at Bosworth Field and became Henry VII, based his entire paper-thin claim to the throne on his royal descent from John of Gaunt. So was Richard III the real king all along? And does royal blood even matter if a secret affair can change a dynasty? Let us know what you think. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.